Welcome to Clarity, a podcast powered by the Thomson Reuters Institute. I'm Zach Warren, the Institute's Technology and Innovation Insights lead. In each episode, we dive deep into a single question from decision makers and thought leaders from legal, corporate, tax accounting and audit, and government communities. In today's episode, we discuss the big question: where can law firms find the fastest ROI on their AI investment? With the rise of generative AI in law, the first question on the lips of many lawyers and firm leaders is, what will this do to my billable hours? And of course, that's a reasonable question, one that is still coming into focus. But at the same time, there are so many hours within firms that are lost to write-downs. With this in mind, utilizing Gen AI doesn't always equate to losing revenue. Firm leaders simply need to be strategic about its applications. So where are time and revenue leaking? To explore this question and provide an avenue toward increased profitability, today's conversation is between Bill Jostin, Legal Marketplace Innovation Insights Strategist at the Thomson Reuters Institute, and Jim Shoemaker, Chief Legal Operations Officer at law firm Miles and Stockbridge.
The views, opinions, and positions expressed by the speakers on this podcast are theirs alone and do not necessarily reflect the views, opinions, or positions of Miles and Stockbridge.
For this latest episode of the Clarity Podcast, I've invited along a good friend of mine and somebody who I've known for a long time, Jim Shoemaker, who is the Chief Legal Operations Officer at Miles and Stockbridge. The reason that I thought that Jim would be a good guest for this episode of the podcast is Jim and I have been having a lot of conversations lately around a topic that I think is particularly timely to the legal industry where we sit today. We happen to be at a really good moment economically in the legal market. We're coming off of a year with strong demand growth. It's widely based. The first quarter numbers are looking pretty good. We're on a multi-year pattern of strong rate growth that's continuing to drive strong profit performance for law firms. So we're in a really good position, but we also have to prepare for what the future may hold. And there's so many things that could be just around the bend. There's concern around the sustainability of demand growth, particularly if litigation demand growth quiets for the year and transactional growth doesn't pick up to take its place. There's concern around the sustainability of our rate growth picture and whether we're going to be able to continue to command the types of rate growth that we've seen for the last several years that have been such a key driver to firm profits. And there's also concern around rising expenses. It's not getting any cheaper to run a law firm these days. So law firms are looking for ways to flex their muscles a little bit and figure out how can they do more to shore up their own profitability. And there's a particular area of concern as it relates to AI. Generative AI has become kind of the 900-pound gorilla in every room. And a lot of law firms are concerned that if they make the AI investments that they're being told are necessary, that ultimately it's going to end up hurting their revenue because it's going to do bad things to their billable hours. And most law firms still rely very, very heavily on billable hours as their main source of revenue from lawyers' work. As Jim and I have been talking, though, we've been having a little bit of a different conversation. And that's the conversation that I wanted to bring to you today. We've been looking more about how AI could drive firms in a much more positive direction in the future and ways that firms could potentially look to not necessarily circumvent, but completely avoid the potential downsides of AI simply by shifting the perspective that they have on how they approach AI and the way they're thinking about it. So with that sort of tee up, Jim, I want to bring you into the conversation here. And before we get too deep into the nerdiness that I know is going to follow, give a minute. And I gave you just a very brief introduction, but why don't you just tell us a little bit more about yourself and kind of your background.
Sure. Thanks, Bill, and I appreciate the invite. It's been a pleasure, knowing you and working with you over the last several years. So my background really started in electronic discovery and legal technology initially, and then I moved over into kind of the client value space, focusing on legal project management and then pricing. And that has sort of evolved in my current firm into a broader legal operations framework. And our team is very much a multidisciplinary team that, in my view, touches the client, life cycle across the board, from the very earliest stages of pitching a client, new business acceptance, clearing conflicts, scoping, pricing, and then figuring out how we're going to staff and bring to bear legal technology or other processes to ensure that we're delivering the work at the expected price. And so our focus, it's a client first mindset that we're bringing into the picture, and in making sure that like those teams are sort of working hand in glove. And so we have we're kind of uniquely positioned to sort of better understand how we're serving the client in a holistic fashion, whereas in other, I think, environments that may be more of a siloed approach. So now I'm leading our AI initiative at the firm, and this is where I actually get to have a little bit more fun. And my passion really is in sort of that service delivery and client value space. And so when I can align that better with, conversations around pricing and so forth, where we can, really demonstrate that we're bringing value in new and in exciting ways. So that's where the work really becomes fun.
Well, I think that focus on client value is so critical. I know we recently released our 2025 State of the Corporate Law Department report from the Thomson Reuters Institute, and the banner headline on that was that corporate law departments are trying to better define their own value and communicate it back to the businesses they serve. And a big part of that is how they receive value and calculate value from their law firms. So having that function focused on that on the law firm side, I think is such an important place to be focused, because clients really will resonate to it and appreciate it. And part of that too is not just, of course, how do you find value for the client? That's absolutely a critical focus. But a lot of that too is how do you create better value and deeper value for the firm that you're serving as well. And one of the things that we've been talking about in this AI context is essentially how much money is sort of slipping through the cracks due to inefficiencies and how legal work is performed and billed. We have a tendency to think, when we think about AI and we think about the hours impact of AI, we think about an impact on billable hours. But there's actually a whole lot more that AI can potentially impact.
No doubt. I think that a lot of the discussions that were going on in the earliest days of generative AI, 2 years ago or even just last year, it was very much a fear-based discussion. I mean, we would have partner retreats where we would talk about this, and we'd be in a room together, and folks were really concerned about that, sort of completely being displaced by generative AI. But what we've learned as we've gotten into sort of our initiative and really starting to experiment with different tools and technologies is that that's not necessarily going to be the case right now. I think it's going to serve a particular need in sort of removing drudgery and things like that, going back to my earlier point, really don't provide much value either internally or externally to the client. And so from a sort of like process improvement standpoint, you're really just going to use these tools, at least in large part, to remove and eliminate that waste. And I think there's probably, I know this is probably a controversial thing to say, but there's a lot of opportunity cost there, right? Like if you're spending time in an inefficient manner, either drafting something or researching something, and half that time is time that you can't charge a client for, that's time that you could potentially be serving another client on a different engagement, or alternatively, investing that time within the organization on, mission critical projects or initiatives that, improve, other parts of the organization. So, the conversation is very fluid. I think everybody's learning as we go through this process, and, it's a challenge. I will say that for sure.
It absolutely is. And one of the things I think that's important to maybe note at the outset of this conversation is uh, it's perhaps a bit of a chicken or the egg sort of thing. Either you and I, if people were to pull up our LinkedIn profiles, they'd notice a bit of an alphabet soup behind both of our names. So I think sort of as a bit of an explanation for that, or to kind of talk about where our perspective on this comes from, that chicken or the egg question we've gone out and attained these different accreditations. You have what's called an ALPP and an ALPM, accredited legal pricing professional, accredited legal project management professional, and I have what's called an ALRAP or an ALRAP, accredited legal revenue assurance professional. Part of that is, we already had an affinity for these types of pursuits, right? So we went out and sought out the coursework and sought out additional education, but then also uh, did enough of it that accreditation came along. So it was sort of this like, we wanted the accreditation, so we went and did the work, but we were also doing the work already, which is what pointed us toward the accreditation. But it's that sort of recognition that there's a lot of potential work to be done in this area, and a lot of things that can be learned, and that field is ever expanding.
Yeah, and it's amazing how interconnected those credentials really are. I mean, I think the ALRAP, the revenue assurance credential, was sort of born out of pricing and legal project management. It really demonstrates to me, either maturity or evolution of sort of how the industry is observing and understanding the entire sort of waterfall, for lack of a better term, and sort of where all the opportunities really rest in terms of being able to capture more revenue, and plug those holes and make sure that we're sort of operating more like a business as we deliver service. And you and your team have laid a lot of the groundwork for a lot of us in the firms who are trying to address a lot of these issues, whether it's, generative artificial intelligence or other sort of, um, process or workflow related things that where we're able to sort of zero in and target opportunities to be more efficient and make sure that we're making the right investments and so forth. So I think when we were talking earlier in another discussion, we really came to the realization that in this really the report that TR did that you led the research on was the law firm billing and efficiency report, which to me really outlined the fact that there's this hidden tax on firms where um, you know they're be due to inefficiencies in other ways that the firm is positioned. There are a significant number of hours that are being invested by partners, associates, and so forth, that simply can't be captured. And a lot of that is just when we say it's hidden. I don't know that firms necessarily have done a very good job of quantifying that. Once you read this report, I mean, it's pretty stark. You can tell, like when you read these numbers to a partner in your firm, it begins to resonate at that point. And I think it's now becoming a really critical set of data points that we can bring into this conversation on generative AI.
Yeah, I have a teammate here at the Institute who talks about the power of 15 minutes. And, we'll write off 15 minutes in various functions in our lives all the time and not really think much of it. But then it very, very quickly adds up, right? You talk about, I love the characterization that you use, that hidden tax on firms, because that's really a great way to think about it. And it's not necessarily a big enough chunk of time in one bite that anybody really notices it, but it's sort of death by a thousand cuts, where there's so many little things that add up. In that report that you referenced, I think we released that the latest version of that in 2023. We talk about the average partner writing down almost $237,000 of their own time on their own matters. Forget about what they do to associates. Forget about what they do to time from other partners or other people. It's just $237,000 of their own time. And that was at 2022 rates. You think about what's happened to rates since 2022. That's a really massive problem. If you take $237,000 that ends up on the accounting room floor, multiplied by every partner at the firm, plus every other timekeeper that's being affected by these types of things. And that's where I think, we had a conversation in the past about taking a holistic look at revenue leakage and examining that entire workflow and work efficiency or work inefficiencies, to try and tie that back to direct financial losses. Because when you quantify that and you put a dollar value on it, that's when partners start to sit up and take notice and say, okay, maybe we really do need to address this. I think there's another thing too that sort of sits into some of this, and that is with that idea of those inefficiencies, it's the ability to bring AI into the system in a way that's going to improve inefficiencies, but not negatively impact billable time or revenue, because it's not being applied to what is otherwise billable time. It's being applied to the waste that's in the system, and that's how you're sort of using that initial look from that holistic revenue analysis to identify those application points rather. That's something you and I have discussed in the past, and I know from a process standpoint, you've seen a lot of that, I'm sure.
No doubt. And I mean, the thing that is, I mean, again, as somebody who is sort of has been focused on legal innovation and process improvement and things like that over the years, I mean, and I've heard other folks in the space talk about this. This really is like a huge game changer for folks in roles like mine, where we have the ability or the benefits of capturing sort of this moment in time. There's a significant amount of buzz around this. It is not nearly as difficult to sort of get bended partner's ear on these things. Whereas before, if you brought up certain tools or technologies or talked about process improvement, it was definitely a much steeper hill to climb. So I'm happy that we're able to sort of seize on this opportunity. And the fact of the matter is, when you looked at sort of the data that came out of your report, Bill, as eye-opening as it was, it wasn't necessarily that hard for that inertia to sort of take hold. Because if you're sort of talking about, okay, how do we address sort of getting up to speed on a new area of law, or how do we reduce the amount of time we're writing off correcting associate work? I mean, that was just an enormous conversation, right? Like, how do you even get started? Well, who are all the stakeholders that we're going to need to include? What systems are we going to have to overhaul? Whereas generative AI kind of gives you this, speed to market is the best way I can sort of think about it. It's such a powerful and accessible tool that you can bring into the firm, and in that same day, a lawyer can learn how to sort of close that part of that gap. So now we have sort of a way to bring solutions directly to those areas where we were seeing either silent write downs or recorded write downs in specific work streams, and it's a really cool opportunity right now for us.
Those two areas that you focus in on, that you mentioned there, Jim, that idea of getting up to speed and correcting your associates' work. You and I are very simpatico on that, because those are the two that I love to focus on as well, because it's something that every lawyer has to do every day, right? Associates just make mistakes. They do. And there's always going to be something where I haven't done it before. I haven't done it in a while. I've never done it in this state. I'm doing some research on it, but I'm not ready to call it research because I'm really not making a whole lot of headway. I'm just kind of getting up to speed on it, right? When you look at the research from the report you've referenced a few times, that's almost 140 hours a year that partners are telling us about. And as I've been presenting on this, various forms of this research for over 12 years now, I've never had a single audience tell me, oh, no, that number's way, way, way too high. I mean, if anything, they tell me that seems really low. But even recognizing that's a conservative number, if you go back to some of the other research the Institute has produced, last year we put out a finding that the average lawyer told us that they thought they could save 200 hours in a year by adopting Gen AI. And a lot of lawyers heard that and they freaked out. What they thought that meant was they were going to bill 200 fewer hours. But if you think about it in the context of that time spent getting up to speed or correcting your associates' work, if you even remove half of that, right? If your associates are producing better work product and you have a tool where as the partner you can go, hey, tell me about this particular topic, and you get a pretty decent summary fairly quickly. If you can cut even that time in half, you're talking about 70 of those 200 hours right there. And you haven't impacted revenue because it was time that wasn't being billed in the first place.
That's exactly right. And that's just sort of internally focused discussion, right? Like, think about how quickly you can turn around and provide client advice and sort of begin strategizing on resolving and reaching better and quicker outcomes on a matter. I mean, that's sort of the client angle as well. So, I mean, I think that's exactly right, Bill. I love that you can sort of shift the paradigm there a little bit and sort of remove the fear-based conversation and sort of say, hey, those are hours that you're working now that you can't bill. Now you're getting those hours back. Think about what you could do with those hours, whether it's, applying that attention to another, important matter, or going out and developing more business. I mean, there's plenty of opportunities there.
That's a great point, Jim. And I think that idea of removing the fear around what Gen AI might do to you, I think that requires having a proactive plan or an intentional framework for what you can do with Gen AI. So it's either what you're going to do with Gen AI or what Gen AI is going to do to you. And we're going to be putting out a paper here in the next couple of weeks. Hopefully early to mid-April, you and I are going to get this wrapped up and put to bed. But part of what we've been talking about is sort of a 5-step framework to identify those opportunities of what you can do with Gen AI. And we haven't put all the meat on the bones yet, but we're talking about some very intentional steps about identifying where the revenue is leaking from, analyzing the root causes of that leakage, mapping AI to the capabilities and or mapping AI capabilities to that financial impact that you want to drive. And then you got to measure the improvements. And then as you sort of see the proof of concept of that, now you can take it to scale, right? But you have a very clear sort of roadmap and framework. And you don't have to start by eating the whole elephant, right? Now you sort of find that initial thing, like, okay, well, the first thing we're going to do, for instance, is we're going to show our partners the tools that they have where they can get up to speed more quickly. And we're going to teach our associates how to use these tools so that they make fewer mistakes, they become better lawyers faster. And so having that framework, I mean, you were sort of the genesis point of the steps in that framework, but I think it's such a logical progression. And I'd love to hear you expand maybe a little bit more on a few of those key areas and why that framework matters so much.
So the inspiration for this, for me personally, was, and I've been spending a lot of time on this in the last 12 months or so, um, in earnest. Been thinking about it for longer than that, but I think most firms and organizations have started with use case experimentation and trying to, it's basically spending a lot of time, um, ex, you know, getting exposure to the different generative AI technologies and learning, what the limitations are, what the benefits are, where they can see the greatest impact with the different tools. It's a really important first step, but it's not the end of the process, or it shouldn't be the end of your strategy. Why it's important, for instance, I think, is the technology is just fundamentally different from any other form of technology that we've encountered. It is a co-intelligence. It's something that you have to individually learn how to work with and integrate into your personal workflows and practice. Um, so that's important because then as an organization, at that level, you can start to establish, a certain level of fluency. That's kind of step one. Um, but the risk and the potential downside of that approach, if that's where you leave it, is that it can take you down a path where, yeah, the tool is really powerful at, improving a certain workflow or task, but it's not connected back to the financial piece, right? So you're not getting a true return on investment. You're really just experimenting for the sake of experimenting. So I think as firms sort of cover off that initial sort of phase, you know, and begin building that fluency, and that there's certain core competencies that you're going to want your lawyers to have, I think it's really important that you sort of pivot and move into this type of framework where you can start to really, to your point, map, what you're learning into sort of a strategy where you're going to deploy resources in a coherent and structured fashion.
Absolutely. And the end point of that is really twofold, right? Where one, you want to be having a positive impact on the firm's financials, but looping back to the initial brief that you were talking about with your legal operations function at Miles and Stockbridge, the ultimate goal is to deliver better value to the client as well. So you have these two paths that seem like they're divergent, but they don't have to be. You can deliver better quality and better value to the client without sacrificing the financial performance of the firm. In fact, you're enhancing the financial performance of the firm potentially.
There's no question, and I think that not to take too much of a detour here, but beyond sort of the data that came out of your report around this hidden tax and sort of mapping things, there's no doubt that there is, for lack of a better term, latent sort of demand out there. There are projects that your clients are not giving you, or that you're not able to take on because of the um, you know, traditional labor model or whatever it may have been. It would have just otherwise been cost prohibitive to execute certain tasks or projects that now with generative AI, if you're folding that into to your service delivery model, you'll be able to do it. You'll be able to do it on the client's budget, and that's net new revenue that you otherwise weren't capturing. We've seen that. We've seen that that's the case. And by the way, your clients are probably expecting you to get to that point. Like they're not, the generative AI buzz is not limited to the legal industry. I mean, every industry right now is sort of wrestling with this. So there's no doubt that the lawyers in the legal department are wondering why their firms aren't coming to them with these solutions. So I think it's really important that we lean into that. So it's sort of a multifaceted thing where there's ways to counterbalance sort of the conversation about lost billable time.
I totally agree with that. The other thing that I've been thinking of a lot when you talk about the ability to go out and deliver really good value to the client, maybe find net new revenue streams. We're at this really weird moment, I think, in almost in history, where the age old axiom that you can have, there's cheap, there's fast, and there's quality. Pick two out of the three, right? That has been an almost immutable law. But I honestly, I think that that's maybe a little bit broken right now, because there are a plethora of use cases that you could potentially think of, and especially if you think about the application of the framework that we've been discussing, where you can do things cheaper, you can do things faster, quality does not suffer. If anything, quality is improved. And ultimately, it results in better overall revenue performance, right? Because you're doing more of it, you're scaling it, you're creating new opportunities. So we have this opportunity to sort of throw that cheap, fast, and quality paradigm out the window. But that's going to be a fleeting moment too. I think, eventually the new standards for cheap and quality and fast are going to be reestablished. So there's an opportunity to move, but you got to do it relatively quickly.
I think that's right, Bill. And ultimately, I think you wind up positioning yourself to elevate the service levels. In fact, you know, anecdotally, I've talked to lawyers in my firm about this, where, you know, I mean, most folks, most lawyers are under, immense time pressures, right? So, think about the lawyer who has to prepare for an appellate argument, right? All of the time that they're spending on the front end, sort of just, managing the cases and, summarizing the cases and distilling that down so that they can get ready to sort of prepare for the argument. If you can reduce the amount of front end work and streamline that, that just means that their preparation and their argument is going to be that much better because they can spend that time on what really matters. So I think that that's where most of this is heading. Um, at the same time, I do think it is important to talk about sort of the need to not just focus on the numbers. This shouldn't be an exercise in trying to figure out how to simply reduce, you know, the inputs and the man hours and all of that. There's this other sort of conversation that's happening and really is critically important around how do you then, it comes down to sort of you know transformation, or organizational change and how you go about addressing. You don't want to erode sort of things like lawyer formation as a result of your reliance on technology. So all of these, like when you're looking at sort of, a specific opportunity around, closing the knowledge gap or getting up to speed, right? There's intrinsic value in how a lawyer performs legal research, and they attain that, the subject matter expertise and knowledge through that process and what was, the traditional apprenticeship model. And that's important because in order to leverage these tools effectively, the user has to be able to supervise and bring to bear that knowledge and expertise to weigh the quality of the output or redirect the technology. So all these things are related. Maybe we're taking hours away from the partner correcting associate work, but that's time that can go more directly to, sort of the maybe a new apprenticeship model, or in a way where a lawyer can be more deliberate about the time that they're spending with that young lawyer to sort of guide them. So those things, along with the client value lens, really need to be applied to the framework here, and I think we'll talk about that in large part in the piece that we'll be working on, Bill.
Jim, I think that might be just a great place to end this particular episode, because I don't know that I really have much that I can add to that. Jim Shoemaker, COO of Miles and Stockbridge, thanks so much for taking the time to join the podcast.
My pleasure, Bill. Thanks for having me, and look forward to working on the paper with you.
Thank you, Jim and Bill. And indeed, some firms are simply getting their arms around AI right now, let alone measuring its impact on the firm at large. But I do agree that it will become increasingly important for law firms across the spectrum to analyze the opportunity of AI strategically. Indeed, this is not just a technology question, it's a fundamental business opportunity that will become more and more common in the coming years. Thank you, as always, for joining us for Clarity, powered by the Thomson Reuters Institute. You can follow or subscribe to this podcast on your favorite podcast platform, and don't forget to share with your colleagues and leave a 5-star review. For more data-driven analysis of today's professional services market and in-depth conversations with industry thought leaders, please visit us online at thomsonreuters.com/institute. You can follow us on LinkedIn under the Thomson Reuters Institute. Clarity is a production of Thomson Reuters, copyright Thomson Reuters 2025.